It's nobody's favorite time of the week again. It's Ask a Rabbi Wednesday. I'm going to bring up a question that I received on JewishAnswers.org a year and a half ago. It's in December of 2014 that I received this question. It was from an Orthodox Jewish man, anonymously, a man in his late 40s, from Forest Hills, Queens, where I went to high school. So this man, he asked, what's the origin of the custom of wearing a Bekishe? Now, a Bekishe, for those who don't know, is it's almost similar to a smoking jacket in certain ways. Especially, there's two types of Bekishes. There's the Tish Bekishe, which is basically like the smoking jacket, but usually with buttons. And then you have the regular plain Bekishe, which is just plain. These are usually black, although not always. Originally they were made of silk or a silk-like material. Nowadays, usually they're polyester or a polysilk blend sometimes. And also, they're worn by Hasidic Jewish men, usually on the Sabbath, although some of the rabbis wear these garments during the weekdays as well, particular Hasidic Rebbes, but many rabbis wear them as well. And generally they're double-breasted with 6 buttons, with 2 rows of buttons, and they go right over left, which is in the Western world more like a woman's garment. And there's many different significances to these various things. So there's many things we could talk about this. Weekdays, many Hasidic men will also wear a similar garment, but it's more with the material. It's more like a regular suit, not shiny, not silky. And then there's another type. There are other similar garments. You have also the kapota, and the weekday one is called the reko, although some people might wear that on the Sabbath as well. And it might be single-breasted or double-breasted, also similar. Then you have the kapota, which is more the Prince Albert frock, which would also be double-breasted, but would have a slit in the back, will have 2 buttons in the back, as the plain Bekishe would have. The Tish Bekishe generally does not, although sometimes it does, generally does not. And also it'll only have 4 buttons on the front, the Prince Albert frock generally, and a slit in the back as well. And that produces an issue as far as wearing 4-cornered garments, whether it needs tzitzis on it, whether it needs fringes to be attached on it, and the way that's often avoided is by rounding off the back corner that's hidden, so it's not technically a corner. There are other similar garments in Jerusalem. There are 3 types of garments that are the traditional Jerusalem wear, and that's often called the kaftan. One is gold and with blue or black stripes, vertical stripes. And that's worn on the Sabbath in many circles, Saron and other Jerusalemites circles, even some non-Hasidic circles as well, and other holy cities as well, Tzfat and Tiberias and Hebron, although not too many wearing in Hebron. But then on the weekdays, certain groups will wear a similar outfit, but that will be more of a grayish, bluish type color, also vertical stripes. And then the other Jerusalemite garb would be more similar to a weekday rekel, single-breasted with buttons and with an attached buttoned belt. And that, among in some cases, will also be worn on the Sabbath, particularly by single men, unmarried men who've never been married, Bachrim, who might actually in those communities wear the shtreimel, which in other communities is only worn after you're married. So anyway, there's many different things to talk about with the Bekishe. Now the word and the other similar garments that various communities might wear or individuals might wear for various reasons. Generally, the kapota or the Prince Albert frock would be worn generally in the non-Hasidic community by rabbis, particularly distinguished rabbis. For example, someone who's a Rosh Hashiva yeshiva. He's the dean of a religious academy. Some might only wear such a garment on the Sabbath. Some might wear it all the time. And in some Hasidic courts, people might also wear it as well. For example, in Lubavitch, that's the garb of the married man for the Sabbath, and certain rabbis even during the week. And it's also, and some other Hasidic rabbis might wear it during the week. Particularly the Karl Stolen Rebbe wears this, the Humidor of Queens wears such, and generally the kapota or the frock coat will be worn with a necktie, which generally in most courts the Bekishe is not worn with a necktie, although in some courts, like we mentioned, Karl Stolen and others, the necktie might be worn with the Bekishe as well. Now the word Bekishe itself is actually a Russian word in etymology. And in Russia, they will call a coat like a standard issue coat that they would give to the army, which is made of sheepskin or rabbit skin, a furry coat. That would be called the Bekishe in Russian. Very different than the Hasidic Bekishe. Although that's perhaps the etymology of the word is related there to the Russian. It seems that the word comes from the Russian. It's interesting. There's another garment. There's the Rizvolke, which is an overcoat Bekishe that's worn by many Hasidic Jews. Some rabbis will wear it during the weekdays as well, and some will, Friday night prayers they might wear it and so forth. In certain Hasidic communities like in Satmar and Babov, and then that type of the Rizvolka, there's another type which many rabbis will wear in the wintertime, which is lined with fur. It'll have an ornate fur collar and perhaps fur cuffs by the arms, and that's called the tilip. And also, interestingly, the Russian coat is also called tulip. So it's the same etymology. The tilip might look a little bit more, in certain ways, like this tulip or the Russian Bekishe, but the Hasidic Bekishe is more, like I said, more like, especially the Tish Bekishe, which is often might be less expensive than the plain Bekishe, but it will have some ornate designs, sometimes even various colors, depending. And that garment is more like a smoking jacket, like Victorian era smoking jacket. Now, but still generally, and it will have a belt with it and so forth. Now, what's the origins of these different clothes? Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Chof Beis, what Aleph says in Sanhedrin 102, it tells the story of Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi was one of the redactors of the Babylonian Talmud, and Rav Ashi had some negative words to say about a particular figure in the Bible, Menashe, the king Menashe, Manasseh. He was the king who was the son of Hezekiah, and he was actually, interestingly, the grandson of Isaiah. And many legends, both preserved in our tradition and in other traditions, preserve that Isaiah, the grandfather of Manasseh, his maternal grandfather, because the Jewish tradition tells us that Hezekiah married Isaiah's daughter, that Manasseh actually assassinated, killed his own grandfather, the great prophet Isaiah. Now, but at the end of his life, Manasseh did repent and come back to God, and the Talmud discusses as to whether or not he gained his place in heaven after his repentance, and it seems at the end that he did, although it was a matter of dispute. And the Apocrypha, which is not part of our canon, not part of the Jewish tradition, records a prayer that Manasseh said upon his repentance. Now, Rav Ashi, many years later, in the end of the Talmudic era, he was the last great leader of the Talmudic era, one of the last great Amoraim. Ravina and Ravashi together were the final redactors of the Babylonian Talmud as we have today. So these figures, Ravashi, one time he's had some negative words to say about King Manasseh. Look what he did. He worshipped idols. How could he do such a thing? How could he be so stupid to worship idols? There's one God. So Manasseh came to him, the ghost of King Manasseh, came to Rav Ashi, and he said, "You don't know what we went through." And it's recorded elsewhere throughout the Talmud that the desire for idolatry was something that we can't imagine. It was very similar, or almost the same, as the sexual desire, and which is something we can't understand. Why would the desire? There's nothing biological. Why would we have an irrational desire to worship idols? But that's how it was in the time of the first temple, and often it's said that this was in order to create a balance, because in that time existed prophecy, and in order to maintain free will, to balance between prophecy was that there was a big Yetzer Hara, a big evil inclination, a desire, a lust for idolatry. So Manasseh came to Rav Ashi, his ghost came to Rav Ashi and said, "If you would have lived in my day, you would have picked up the hems of your garment to run to worship idols." That was the answer that King Manasseh gave to Rav Ashi. So I've heard in the name of the Hasidic masters, we see from there the significance in general of wearing long garments, because we can't run to sin because it gets in the way. It's difficult to run wearing a long robe. And it seems that throughout Jewish history, the standard garb of a pious Jew was to wear long clothing. In general, they didn't have pants in those days, so they would wear long robes with a belt, because there's also halacha liberus erva. There has to be a separation between the heart and the lower organs, and so some kind of belt. Nowadays we have pants with a belt or with elastic or whatever. It's not necessary. However, in addition to that, there's also the mentioned in the Talmud and the Code of Jewish Law that for prayer one should put on some sort of a sash or a belt or something in honor of prayer, and that's an addition, an extra thing in honor of prayer. And that's where the Hasidic custom of wearing a gartel comes from, which is an addition, meaning to the belt that might be attached to a robe or something. That would be worn all the time. The gartel would be specifically for prayer, although you have certain Hasidic courts like Skver and Belz where they wear the gartel all the time, and others like Munkach where they're very strict only to wear the gartel during prayer, because Mishum Hikun L'Kras Yisrael. That it says in the book of Amos, you should prepare to meet your Maker, to meet your God, O Israel. And that meaning that there should be some special preparation for prayer, and so it's mentioned in the Talmud that the custom at that time was to wear some sort of a sash. That's where the Hasidic custom of the gartel comes in. Other communities say might we wear a jacket, a tie, a hat, and things like that. Now, but the Bekishe itself, so it would seem that the long garments would have something to do with preventing sin, like we mentioned the story of Rav Ashi and Manasseh. In general, though, the most of the Jewish communities, they wore some sort of long robes, and it would also seem that this would be for modesty purposes, just like women wear skirts, so they don't have the outline of the legs visible through pants. So too would be. It seems like that would be appropriate for men. The Gerach Hasidim put great emphasis on that. So that's why you will see in the Gerach Hasidic community, which is a community from Poland, that even people who are newcomers in general will wear a long rekel even during the week, which is not common in other communities. Even if they're wearing a not particularly Hasidic hat, they might still wear the fedora of the Lithuanian communities. I mean, it's really an Italian fedora, but they'll wear that type of a hat with a long rekel, because of this idea of modesty. It's similar to how the Muslims have when they pray. Also, the similar ideas of wearing a long robe. They probably got that from the Jewish sources, and that's why, like among the Ger Hasidim generally, you'll see that they'll very rarely go in public without some kind of a robe. And so if it's very hot out, they'll might wear something more like a bathrobe, very light, but some kind of a robe to cover their whole body. Whereas other groups are not as careful for that. Now it's the question of longer clothes on Sabbath or during the week. It's mentioned in the poskim. I think Beis Yosef brings it down that there's an Indian to have the clothes that you wear on Shabbos be longer during the week. So that's why you'll see in some communities they might wear a regular suit jacket during the week, or something shorter during the week, and on the Sabbath they'll wear the Bekishe or a rekel, perhaps on the Sabbath in some communities or some individuals. Now the Bekishe itself is generally, like I said, today is generally made of polyester, and originally was made of silk. And this has particular significance because we want to avoid wearing shatnez. Shatnez, of course, the Bible prohibits wearing garments of mixed wool and linen. And so by avoiding wearing wool clothes or linen clothes altogether, it made it much easier. So the rabbis would wear silk all the time, the whole week. That's the clothes they would wear would be silk in order to avoid this problem of wool and linen. They just avoided wearing wool altogether. The only wool that they would wear was the talis, the tzitzis, the prayer shawl. Other than that, they wouldn't wear wool. And so the rabbis, that's why all week would wear a Bekishe. In the early times of the Hasidic movement, everyone wore white on the Sabbath and black during the weekdays, or other dark colors, black or gray or brown or blue. Nowadays, black is the most popular, but you see sometimes blue. And one time in history, dark gray was more popular, or brown, for weekdays. They met with opposition from the opponents of the Hasidic movement, and so that's why, for the most part, many started to wear black even on the Sabbath, and even in some cases, even the Rebbes would wear black on the Sabbath, although in the others they would wear white Bekishes on the Sabbath, or other colors, silver or blue or gold and so forth, and maybe mixed with black. The Kabbalists frowned on wearing black on the Sabbath, and they often suggested only to wear white. So there's many different approaches throughout that, but that's one particular significance, is avoiding wearing shatnez, because if it's all silk and nowadays all polyester, then you don't have to worry about shatnez. Nowadays, of course, we have laboratories that check for shatnez, so they will make wool rekels and suits for Hasidic men, and they will be checked at the laboratory to make sure there's no shatnez in them. But and still, most of the rabbis will avoid wearing wool altogether. I think the Satmar Rebbe, like if he wore a sweater when it's cold outside, he sometimes would put on a sweater, and he would make sure that it was made from that it was made from polyester or other man-made materials, so there would be no wool in it. He was very careful not to wear wool other than the talis and tzitzis. Even I think there was one time a belt. He wanted to make sure that even in the stitching on the belt that there's no shatnez. So he was very careful with that, and that was generally the Hasidic custom. And in earlier years, the Hasidic shtibels, they wouldn't let someone lead the prayer if they were wearing any wool. And so therefore the rekels they would wear in the week usually would be cotton or some other material, not wool. But like I said, nowadays wool is more common than it used to be. You could still buy wool. You can go to G&G and buy wool Bekishe, wool kapata, and so forth, and it will be checked for shatnez, although they also make polyester and other materials. So that's one big significance of the Bekishe, is avoiding wearing shatnez, and also being long to avoid it being for tznius purposes, and also in honor of the Sabbath. Some people suggest that the shininess, even of the black Bekishes, makes it that it's not technically black, to avoid the problem that the Kabbalists frowned on wearing black on the Sabbath. So therefore, you have different approaches as to the reason and the history of wearing the Bekishe. In general, it wasn't originally a Hasidic garment, so to speak. Most of the Jews in Eastern Europe wore clothes similar to the Hasidim today, although the hats might have changed and buttons are a newer invention. And for a long time there were no buttons, and some people even today still have shirts with no buttons, and they'll have, the Yerushalmi kaftan, gold kaftan, and will have no buttons. It'll just be a plain robe, and they would avoid wearing buttons because it's a more modern style. Although not similar, like how Amish also don't wear buttons, but today most people do wear buttons. It's not like how it used to be that they didn't wear buttons. Some of the Rebbes have struckers also, which has clasps, doesn't have buttons. But since there really was no problem with the buttons, the main thing was that it should be right over left. Even many Hasidim will wear shirts that are right over left, because to demonstrate, also, first of all, to be different than the non-Jews around them, because the Chukas HaGoy, there's a prohibition in Deuteronomy of following in the statutes of the nations around you. So there's one thing to be different. I once asked, is that a question of Loi Silbash, you're not allowed to wear women's garments, because that's the fashion of women to have that way? And they said no, because it's made specifically for men. But also, it's right over left, because right in Kabbalah represents Chesed and left represents Din. And so that's that Chesed, kindness, should be over strict justice, and we should be merciful and kind. So they once said, what's a chassid? Is a yid which is surrounded by chesed, So anyway, there are many other things that the Bekishe represents. In the history, the first Jews who stopped wearing long garments were the German Jews. They started to wear the more modern style of the suit jackets, but still, even in Germany, many still wore the frocks, like we have the Prince Albert frock that the Lithuanian rabbis wear and the Chabad wear. I once saw a picture of a chassid saying, wishing a Happy New Year to a Reformed Jew. This was in Germany, I guess, and the chassid wore very long, almost Levantine style robes, no buttons, and with a big yarmulke, not a hat. Not any brimmed hat, just a plain yarmulke, and the Reform Jew, and the Chassid had a big long beard, and the Reform Jew. This you can look up. There's a website for the PBS special made in the 90s, A Life Apart, which is the history of the Hasidim in America, and they have this picture there, and it's quite interesting to see the Reform Jew is dressed like a Rosh Hashiva would. He had a short beard, trimmed beard, and a kapota, a Prince Albert frock, and a Hamburg hat, like the like very Orthodox rabbis wear today. So it's interesting, and still today, for example, in the German in Breuer's, the chief rabbi will wear still a kapota. That's a very strict Orthodox community, so it's not the German Jews are often, as even very Orthodox ones, they have very specific customs, very ancient customs. They're often called yekas, and they said that comes from that they would wear the short jackets instead of the long frocks. Now, what happened eventually, historically, was that the Tsar outlawed wearing specifically Jewish clothing. And so in Russia and the areas that were under Russian Tsarist control, most of the Jews, except some rabbis who were aloof from society and were able to hide, and they're, among their own, didn't go out in the street and so forth, they stopped wearing traditional Jewish garments. They stopped wearing the shtreimel, they stopped wearing a bekishe, of the Hasidic style. Many people often say that these styles came from Polish noblemen. There's really no historical records for that. This whole idea came about rather recently. And if you look at what the Polish noblemen wore, it was very, very different types of styles. It was still long, but it was more colorful and very different types of styles, more fur in different places. Now, So what happened was in Lithuania and Russia is they stopped wearing the Jewish styles, and that's why the Lithuanian non-Hasidic Jews stopped wearing the shtreimel, stopped wearing the Bekishe, except those who came to Jerusalem before this decree was made. And that's why you'll see the old Jerusalemite communities, they still wear the shtreimel and Bekishe or kaftan or different like this. Even though they're not Hasidic, the followers of the Vilna Gaon, and they dress in the style like the Hasidic style. So that's why also in Lubavitch, also the Chabad Hasidim were mostly Kapuster Hasidim, not Lubavitcher Hasidim, who came to Shalayim before this decree was made, still wore the shtreimel and the Bekishe. But those who come from Europe directly, instead of the Bekishe, put on a kapota, a frock coat, and they wore a regular hat, except the Rebbe, the Rebbe Ayatz, still wore a shtreimel, and he had a kolpik, the more old, the different fur hats that he wore. He also wore a Hamburg hat. And then when his son-in-law, became the next one that they said was the Rebbe, many of the Chassidim accepted. Most of them from the Lubavitch community, not all of them though. It wasn't universally accepted. He changed his style to be a fedora. She's working. A bent down fedora, So anyway, part of the reason he did that was because his mother-in-law did not want him to be the successor, and so she refused to give him his father-in-law's fur hat, the shtreimel or kolpik that he had, and so because she didn't recognize him to be the next Rebbe, she wanted another son-in-law to be the successor. The Gerach Hasidim, interestingly, stopped wearing the shtreimel, but they put on the spudik, which actually is Mongolian in origin, very similar to shtreimel, but a little higher, made of, it's cheaper to make. It's not made out of tails the way the shtreimel is made. It's made of a regular, solid piece of fur, so it was easier to make. And so therefore, that was and that was for the same reason why the Litvische, the Lithuanian non-Hasidic groups, and the Chabad stopped wearing the shtreimel, and they just wore a regular hat on the Sabbath. So the Gerach Hasidim put on spudiks. It's taller, it's similar like a kolpik, but it's black. And so that's the history of how that took place. And many Lithuanian rabbis also, for a while, wore the spudik style, although that fell out of style, although some still did. Rav Hutner did, and Shlomo Freifeld, others even in our current times eventually put on the spudik, as was style in Lithuania in some cultures, particularly by the rabbis. So that's basically what I could say for now. I've already spoken for almost a half hour about this. So if anybody has any questions other than this, or other comments and questions about the Bekishe or rebuttals of anything I've said, please feel free to mention the comments. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and please send us more questions for next week's video or future videos. You can put them in the comments below or send them to me directly. And please, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you so much for joining us. God bless you. And just a few other ideas about the Bekishe, though, is very interesting. In some communities now, you'll see that people who are not, it's stylish in many communities to wear the Bekishe with a necktie and with another hat, or a fedora, or even among single men, fedora, and or a bent-up hat, or necktie, different styles. And these reflect various different styles that we have in different communities, and they're all very beautiful ways of honoring the Sabbath, or however it is, and honoring the Torah in general, and fulfilling these various inyanim, and avoiding shatnez, following the heathen styles. Even though they'll say, "Oh, but it comes from these styles," it really doesn't. The Bekishe styles we have, even though the words come from different places. Another thing that I wanted to mention about the Jerusalem kaftan, the legend goes, is that why did they wear the Jerusalem kaftan, is that Eretz Yisrael, Palestine, under that time, the land of Israel, was under Turkish rule, Ottoman rule. And the Ottomans thought that Ashkenazic Jews were spies for Russia. In fact, many very pious and great rabbis, even particularly notably the Balatanya, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the first Rebbe of Chabad, he sat in prison because people made up false lies about him that he was a spy for the Russians, for the Turks, against the Russians. They told the Russians that he was spying for the Turks. Why? Because he was sending charity to poor Jews in Jerusalem. And so they thought that he was supporting somehow the Turks, and so he wound up in prison for that. He almost got executed for it. And the problem was in the reverse also, was that the Turks assumed that they accepted the Sephardic Jews, but they thought the Ashkenazic Jews were spies for Russia, even if they didn't come from Russia, even if they came from Hungary or somewhere else. Incidentally, that's why I'll get back to, I mentioned Hungary for a second. And so that's why they had the Ashkenazic hats, but the yarmulkes were white, knitted with a pom-pom, and the coats would be more like the Sephardic style, the Eastern style, with colorful stripes, vertical stripes. Sometimes called a ksonas pasim, like it says in the Bible that Jacob gave Joseph a coat of many colors. That's called pasim, the design of the kaftan, even though it's probably not exactly like that. But I don't think it was exactly like the Joseph's amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat either. I mentioned, Hungary is a different situation. Even the non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox in Hungary still maintain the Shtreimel and the Bekishe, those words. We see the Erlo community in Jerusalem, which is not a Hasidic community, but dresses in the Hasidic style, with the Shtreimel and the chief rabbi wears also colorful rabbinical Bekishe. They recently lost their chief rabbi. It's a direct line from the Chassam Sofer. Although the Chassam Sofer was a student of a Hasidic Rebbe, the Haflah, he himself was not particularly, he wasn't necessarily Hasidic. He mixed Hasidic and non-Hasidic influences in a way, which is in general how it was in Hungary. Hungary wasn't strictly, there wasn't a strong anti-Hasidic approach, and not strongly Hasidic. Even the Hasidim in Hungary were generally more balanced and normal, didn't have the extremes, and even those who did still had a certain balance and ehrlichkeit. And the thing is because Hungary, of course, was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it had nothing to do with Russia, so these type of decrees never were made in these countries. And so that's why in Hungary and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were able to maintain the traditional clothing much longer, until just peer pressure, a lot of people chose on their own, particularly in Austria and Vienna, and even in Hungary, in the big cities, in Budapest, they started to change from the traditional garb, but the more traditional rabbis still maintained it as well. So again, thank you for joining us. Please like, share, subscribe, and you can feel free to put comments both on this video and questions in the comment section for future videos. Thank you very much, and God bless.